Hello, my friend. Welcome to my show Chronicles of a Learner RN, and thank you for listening. My name is Ritika, and I'm a registered nurse working out of Melbourne, bringing my experiences and learnings to a wider audience. Today, we'll be taking a break from the lungs after my last two episodes on asthma and the flu, and we'll be diving into the world of diabetes instead. So let's talk all things DKA and HHS. As a disclaimer, I will not be providing any personalized information. All names, numbers, and results will be altered to protect the privacy of the patient these stories are derived from. So let's begin with context. Today's story is of a middle-aged man that came into ED just a few months ago, and the story is as follows. This man's roommate, who actually turned out to be his identical twin brother, which is, I'll get to that little fun tidbit of the story in a little bit. The roommate called AV because the patient looked quite sick. He had had a new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes but was only on oral medications. He had been supposedly drinking lots of sugary drinks over the last maybe 2-3 days before presentation and had been ended up peeing quite a bit over those said 2 days. On AV arrival, he was GCS 9, BP was low, so they gave fluids, and his GCS came up to about 12 to 13. But he was extremely cerebrally agitated, meaning he was confused. And when we say cerebrally agitated, these people just can't really sit still. Arms are flinging all over the place. They just want to stand up. They just want to move. But we need them to sit still. Anyway, so he came in, he was GCS 12 by this point and maintaining his own airway, but I think he needed jaw thrust a little bit when he first came in. So basically his tongue was rolling to the back of his mouth and occluding his airway. So what you do is you grab the back of the jaw and you just sort of lift it forward to move the tongue forward, and you'll find they start breathing pretty well again once their whole sort of bottom jaws move forward. Anyway, we did his bloods, and his BGL was HI, high, on the BGL monitor, and his ketones was 7.0. Now, these are the highest ketones I've ever seen. Previously, the highest I'd seen, probably in the 5s, but the first time I got introduced to high ketones was back when I was on the ward. And we'll get into that story in one of my mental health episodes, which is sneak peek, it's coming soon. But anyway, back to the story. Even on the VBG that we took, his BGL was incalculable, meaning it was above the VBG machine's max reading of 32. We sent off a proper blood test serum glucose, and it turned out his BGL was 72. And that's the highest BGL I've ever seen in my life. And I was like, God. Basically, because that blood test takes a little while to come back, because of the ketones, we were treating him as a DKA. And at that time, obviously, we didn't know the true BGL. Also, we treated him for sepsis with IV therapy, IV antibiotics, and the lot, We've discussed this many times before. He ended up getting an art line for his BP monitoring due to persistent hypotension, even after the IV therapy, and even after frequent push doses of metaraminol, which is a vasopressor. Though, because he was cerebrally agitated, it was very, very difficult to keep the art line in that sort of optimal position where he needed to sit still to get a good enough trace to get an accurate blood pressure anyway. So I don't think it was very useful, I think is the best word for it, but I didn't look after him long enough to know. We ended up starting the NORAD after the metaraminol didn't work, and we followed the DKA pathway until it was time for me to go home. And then I don't really know what happened to him after that. But I do assume that he went to ICU because he was quite sick and he was on vasopressors. It was about a day or two after that when I caught up with the resus reg that was on that day, and she discussed it with me. that it's actually possible for people to not just be in DKA or HHS, but to be in both. And we'll discuss that very soon. Now, I haven't told you what DKA or HHS stands for, but I will in a second. First, though, let's discuss diabetes mellitus, or just in the layperson terms, diabetes. What is it? How does it work? And why do they get complications? So, there are two essential players in the world of diabetes. Can you guess? Come on, take a guess. Take a guess. Yes, you're probably right. It's glucose or sugar and insulin. Glucose and insulin. Some of you may have mentioned ketones, and while they are important, they are not the main characters of the stock standard diabetes. They are more like the evil villain's trusty sidekick when things get bad. So, glucose is essential for life to thrive. As we discuss in our sepsis episodes, two things that are paramount to energy formation, or ATP formation, are glucose and oxygen. In the average Joe body, assuming average Joe does not have diabetes, we eat glucose throughout the day. Everything has glucose in it. Carbs, juice, sugar itself, lactose, fructose, proteins, fats, everything in its original form contains at least some amount of glucose. And obviously proteins and fats get broken down into different things as well, but glucose is mixed up in there. And every balanced meal has some glucose in it. It's not something to be afraid of. We need it to survive. But then the thing is, how do the cells know how to use this glucose that once it's broken down and enters the bloodstream, how do they know to use it to make ATP? In comes our second main character, insulin. Insulin is a hormone created and excreted by the pancreas to control the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. It provides the means for glucose to enter the cell. So if we think about it in this, now I'm going to tell you, I've written this down because it's an awesome analogy that I just made up maybe like 10 minutes ago. If glucose tried to willy-nilly get into the cell and say the cell is like this nightclub or something, the bouncer would go, bro, we're closed for the night. Even though glucose can see that there's a raging party going on inside. But to the rescue, glucose's cool friend, insulin, rocks up and the bouncer goes, oh, insulin, I know you. You guys can go in. And the bouncer lets glucose and insulin in. But insulin doesn't want to go in because they don't even like clubs. They were just there for their good friend glucose. And thus, insulin is the key to get glucose inside the cell. Bada bing, bada boom. What a great analogy. I know. I'm so creative. So in the world of diabetes mellitus, there are two distinct issues with glucose uptake or usage, depending on how technical you want to be. Either there is no insulin being produced by the pancreas, and this is an autoimmune issue where there's absolutely zero insulin, or the insulin receptors have become resistant to insulin. Therefore, it is being produced probably in less quantities than the normal person, but they are being produced. But the receptors are just not acting as efficiently as they should to clear up the glucose from the bloodstream. These are the basic of basics pathogeneses of type 1 diabetes and type 2, respectively. Type 1 being zero insulin. No insulin being produced by the body themselves. It has to be artificially sort of popped in there. Type 2 is where there is insulin production, or less than the normal, but there is. It's just not being used appropriately or has become resistant. So type 1, type 2. With type 2, usually people start, before I get into DK, with type 2, most people can either survive being diet controlled, so limiting the amount of sugar they put into their body. They can get put on oral hypoglycemics, so oral medications that actively reduce the amount of sugar in the blood. These include, you've probably heard of them, metformin, glycoside, I think that's how you say it. There's another one, empagliflozin, if that's how you say it. I think that's how you say it. Don't bash me if that's not how you say it. But there are oral medications you can take. If those start to not work, then you may get put onto insulin, like type 1 diabetics. But you don't get called a type 1 diabetic because that is an autoimmune disease. If you need insulin and you're type 2, you're called either a type 2 diabetic on insulin or I think it's insulin dependent type 2 diabetic. Depending on who you talk to, people call it different things. I just call it type 2 diabetes on insulin. And then if they're on orals, I call it type 2 or T2DM on OHG, oral hypoglycemics. That's how I write it on the computer. So enough about diabetes. You're probably pros by now. Let's talk about DKA. What is it? DKA stands for diabetic ketoacidosis. So let's break that down. DKA is a complication to an autoimmune condition, so the type 1 diabetes. This was initially perceived as fact, but has been sort of debunked in the last few years, that only people with type 1 diabetes can get DKA. But now we know, even though it's rare, some people with type 2 diabetes can get DKA. Like our old pal, I don't think I gave him a name. We'll call him Diabetes Man. Asthma Man, Flu Man, now we've got Diabetes Man. Have you noticed they're all men too? Something to keep in mind. I'm just kidding. Anyway, Diabetes Man is one of those examples of someone with type 2 diabetes going into DKA. So it's not impossible, it's just not very common. But anyway, in type 1 diabetes, the body cannot produce its own insulin. The pancreas just doesn't do it. Therefore, without supplementing with externally given insulin, the body will not be able to use the glucose. This is why we tell people with type 1 diabetes, or we get told as well, even if they're not eating or they're not drinking well, you need to give them their insulin, because withholding their insulin, even when they're not eating, doesn't make sense, because you need even just a little bit of insulin at all times. So, as we know, insulin is the key for glucose to be actually used as an energy source in the cell. Without insulin, it just won't work. This is why in DKA, there is no insulin to do the correct job. Therefore, glucose in the bloodstream just keeps rising and rising and rising and is not being used. Therefore, the body goes into like shutdown or lockdown, whatever you want to call it. And to actually produce energy, albeit in an inefficient way, the body begins to use fatty acids, which break down to become the ketones we know and love. If you're into ketosis or like the keto diet, you do love it. If you're not into the keto diet, like most people, and you really like food, then you probably don't like it. But anyway, this is the foundation of diabetic ketoacidosis. The ketones. They are the foundation. So basic pathophysiology is very similar to what I have been saying this whole time. But basically no insulin, no glucose getting into the cell. Body goes, oh my God, we need energy. So they break down fatty acids into ketones, which then get used in an alternate sort of pathway to create less ATP, which is why your body just doesn't continue on as normal. It gets sick when it needs to use ketones. Unless you are supplying the body with more fat to use than sugar or like glucose. This is why people on the keto diet may not feel sick, even though they have high ketones, because they are supplementing their body with those fatty acids that it needs to continue producing ketones instead of using glucose. Anyway, that was a little diversion. Let's get back to the thingy, my little script here. So, basically, no insulin, glucose keeps rising, but when this happens, the body now needs to get rid of the glucose in the bloodstream. So it's using the ketones for energy, but it's still got all this glucose hanging around because it's quite toxic to the brain. Little tidbit of, I called it a niblet, a little bit of extra info. When I didn't talk about the stroke pathway in my stroke episode, but if it's something you'd like to hear about, let me know. In the stroke pathway, even if the patient is not diabetic, we still do 4 times a day, we do BGLs on them because extra glucose in the blood is toxic to the brain. And we give insulin in those cases to bring the sugar down because we don't want to further harm the brain in cases of stroke. But anyway, to get rid of the glucose in the body does this thing called osmotic diuresis. Diuresis is the act of removing fluid from the body through urination, and then osmotic diuresis is when glucose is being excreted through the kidneys and then through the pee. But with glucose comes extra water, thus needing to pee a lot and the sudden dehydration. Because you're peeing out the glucose and you're peeing a lot of water comes with it. Glucose as well, just to add to the multitude of problems your body is now facing. Glucose is a way bigger molecule than water. Thus, when it's passing through the kidneys and the little I forgot the words, from the little holes that molecules go through to get filtered, it can cause injury. This leads to an acute kidney injury, just purely based on how big the molecules are and how much trauma the filtration units go through getting those glucose through. But then to compound on that with all the water going through it and the dehydration, that just makes your acute kidney injury worse. And then on top of that, because this is not bad enough already, the keto acids or the ketones, which are acids, end up using a lot of the bicarb from our lovely buffering equation that we talked about in the sepsis episodes, when we talked about our VBG and how the body maintains an appropriate pH. Because we've got lots of acids in the body now through the keto acids, the kidney dispatches a lot of bicarb to sort of buffer them out and get the pH back to normal. This causes a metabolic acidosis, further the kidney injury, and this is why we call it ketoacidosis. Mind blown. Now, I've left out a lot in this explanation of DK, like the pathophysiology. I did a whole paper on it, and this is the most basic I can get without rattling off my assignment word for word. But if that's something you're interested in and how the body reacts to different aspects of DKA to maintain that compensation, then let me know. Maintain the compensation? Maintain homeostasis. Compensates to maintain homeostasis. I don't know English. It's alright, guys. Don't mind me. But anyway, let's look at presentation. How do these people present usually to the hospital? Funny story. The what was it called? Patient portfolio. Was that what it was called? I don't know. That I chose for my DKA thing from last semester. My patient, my very, very real patient, I called him Joaquin. Anyway, stupid, don't mind me. DKA is often sudden onset, usually happens within hours or at the latest days. Common reasons either are illness causing a stress response, feeling off, not eating, not taking insulin despite not eating. And you would be surprised at how very, very common type 1 diabetics just don't take insulin because they're not eating, even though everyone is explicitly told that even if you don't eat, take some insulin. Maybe not your whole dose, but take maybe like 25% of the dose because you need insulin. A lot of people don't do this. Another common presentation is actually the first presentation of DKA for a lot of people and mostly teenagers because autoimmune condition, this usually gets diagnosed when people are in their teens. This happens, like first presentation is usually DKA because these kids don't know that their pancreas has essentially stopped working and then they get sick because of that, as opposed to feeling sick, not taking insulin, and then exacerbating that through DKA. And then I did mention the stress response. We'll talk about that towards the end. Why stress can lead to increased BGL and decreased insulin. Managing DKA, though, despite how complex the pathophysiology is rather simple. Somebody somewhere created a very easy flowchart for us to sort of figure out how much of what we need to do when. There are three main facets of this DKA flowchart. IV therapy to correct dehydration. Usually in the start, it's quite aggressive. You'd be doing liters as fast as you can until, well, you don't want to overload them. So you do like maybe 1 or 2 liters as fast as you can and then go on to maintenance hydration. The second facet is IV potassium. Now, I didn't mention that in my pathophysiology, but let's go through it now. Potassium in this case can already be low due to dehydration if you sort of vomit or diarrhea it out through your gastric contents. That's one way to reduce potassium. But the reason we care about potassium, even if it's normal at the start of the DKA flowchart, is because in that analogy of glucose getting into the club with insulin, what I forgot to mention is that glucose's friend potassium, who's a bit of a weirdo, nobody really wants to hang with him. He's sort of hanging at the side, getting ready to go in with glucose and insulin, meaning once insulin lets glucose into the cell, it actually lets potassium into the cell as well, meaning potassium and glucose have gone into the club together. So in DKA, when we start giving IV insulin through an infusion to obviously bring the sugars down, this causes an influx of potassium to enter the cell, meaning there's like this transient shift in serum, so bloodstream level potassium. Despite the total concentration of potassium in the body somewhat remaining the same, because a lot of it is now inside the cell and not in the bloodstream, this can cause potassium levels to fall. Now, we know that the potassium will eventually get out of the cell, but if they fall, bloodstream or serum potassium falls to critical levels, it still can cause arrhythmias, like we talked about, I think, no, I don't think we did. But it still can cause hypokalemia, which can cause arrhythmias, which we don't want. So, even though we know that it'll get out of the cell eventually, we want to replace potassium alongside the insulin to make sure that we're on top of it and we don't bring about any unnecessary arrhythmias. That being said, big daddy of managements is IV insulin. We needed to bring down the sugars. We needed to stop ketone production. And yeah, that's why only 2 reasons we need it. But though I mentioned BGL first, quite the main reason we want to continue insulin is to get rid of the ketones. That is why when we're on this insulin infusion and we get to a certain BGL, I think it's like 15 or something like that, we actually start IV dextrose or glucose. 10%, I think it's part per whatever. We start IV glucose to maintain the sugar. It's at a slow rate. To maintain the sugar at that sort of high-ish, but not too high level, and so we can continue the insulin to bring down the ketones until they're zero. We don't stop insulin until ketones have resolved, even if BGL is already falling. Ketones are the main thing we want to fix because it's ketoacidosis. But yeah, we monitor it with frequent BGLs, finger prick ketones, and VBGs to ensure BGL and ketones return to normal, but also to make sure the metabolic acidosis has resolved. Only once the ketones have come to 0 or below 0.6 will the IV insulin and IV dextrose stop. But another thing to keep in mind is once you stop the IV insulin, it's important to give subcut or subcutaneous into the tummy insulin to tide them over to their normal routine. Otherwise, they'll just bounce back into DKA again. It's happened to me before. It wasn't very good, and the kid was a little annoying. But yeah, that's DKA in a nutshell. It's very, very basic. 20, 25 minutes, 15 minutes. I don't even know how long I was speaking for. My paper on DKA was a lot longer than this. So very, very basic. If you want me to go into more detail though, please let me know in the comments. So let's talk about HHS. I still haven't told you what HHS stands for. And it stands for hyperglycemic hyperosmol something. Yes, okay, I got it wrong. Hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. And unlike DKA, sorry, I should just read what I've written here. It's commonly coined DKA for the type 2, but that is factually incorrect. It is not DKA, but it is exclusive to type 2 diabetes. Someone with type 1 cannot get HHS, whereas in DKA, people with type 2, although rare, can get DKA. This is because in HHS, I'm not going to call it hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state again, so keep that in mind. In HHS, there's just enough insulin production to stop ketone production, but not enough to adequately uptake glucose into the cell. So there's enough aura around insulin to keep ketones out, not ketones. I don't know where I'm going with that. Just erase that from your mind, guys. Basically, the pathophysiology is quite similar to DKA, just the caveat that it doesn't create ketones. It just raises the sugar higher and higher and higher. Then you get the same symptoms. You get the increased urination, you get the osmotic diuresis, you get the dehydration, and you get the hyperglycemia, which can cause cerebral agitation because now we know glucose in the bloodstream is toxic to the brain. We're so smart. But in HHS, there are... Actually, no, I've written that under compare and contrast. Let's keep going. Management differences. There aren't many differences between the management of HHS and DKA, except for the fact the main thing we want to fix in HHS, like the main thing, is dehydration. Because HHS usually has a gradual onset, so it could be over days to about a week before they start to get really sick. This allows the body to essentially become worse in the dehydration sense. That's why we want to rehydrate of the utmost importance. And then we give the insulin, obviously, to reduce BGL. But once the BGL and the dehydration and the underlying cause, so like in this case, would have been infection for diabetes man is resolved, the patient may not actually need to stay on insulin. They could go back to oral medications. But it's unlikely with this guy though, because he was already maxing out on the oral medications and he had only just been diagnosed. So likely he was put on insulin. And if he was going to continue with his sugary diet anyway, this was just going to happen again. So probably needed to keep on insulin. Though, getting back to the story, he did, like, him and his roommate. Oh, I didn't even mention the roommate thing. Anyway, I'll mention that at the end. They seem to not have the greatest health literacy, which is fine. Not everybody needs to know medical grade, medical knowledge. But if you're diagnosed with something, the expectation is that you know sort of what you're dealing with, know what not to have, what to have. Didn't seem like it with this guy though. So, and we may, basically management is the same. Sorry, I'm going back. I'm rambling now. You need IV therapy, you need potassium, you need IV insulin. You wouldn't really need dextrose because the main thing you're trying to do is reduce BGL. Once it's reduced adequately, then you can probably stop. And maybe even move to subcut for a little while. So the differences between DK and HHS is basically the criteria to be diagnosed is very important. To be diagnosed with DK, now we know you can either have type 1. Type 1 is a very major contributing factor. If you've got type 1, it's very likely you've got DK because you can't have HHS. But if you've got type 2, then this distinction is important. Because DK, you need to have ketones above a certain level. I think it's 5 millimoles or something to that effect. And the BGL actually can't be too high. It needs to be less than 54, 55 millimoles as well. Usually in DK, it's between the 20s to 30s. But obviously it can be higher. But it needs to stop at 55 or 54. To be considered HHS, though, ketones must be low, like less than 3 millimoles, and BGL must be above this 54 to 55 arbitrary number that I recall reading somewhere. So it's probably not very arbitrary. But yeah, that is the main criteria. You need to have extremely, extremely high BGL to be considered for HHS. That is why with diabetes man, he had mixed because his BGL was above 55, it was 72. But his ketones were above 5, they were 7. So he's meeting the criteria for both HHS and DKA, which is why we called it a mix. Comparing them, they both have very similar symptoms. They both have the peeing, the dehydration, the agitation, reduced GCS. The only difference in symptoms that you might be able to actually tell is you may have heard ketone breath, where the main ketone used in that's made in DKA is acetone. When acetone is being produced by the body, this can cause a fruity odor to come out of the mouth. I personally haven't smelt it. I've got one of the consultants that I work with. She is like, yes, I'm very sensitive to the acetone smell. So she can just tell from smelling someone that they've got DKA. But that is a symptom you'll see in DKA because of the ketones. You won't see in HHS. And then, like I mentioned before, HHS is gradual onset, whereas DKA is more or less sudden within hours or days. So that's basically it for HHS in a nutshell. Exclusive to type 2 diabetics, you need to have BGL more than 55. You need to have little or no ketones because there is just enough insulin to stop the ketones from being produced. Management is more or less the same. You want to fix the dehydration because it's going to be worse than someone with DKA because of that gradual onset. You want to fix the BGL with IV insulin, and you want to supplement with potassium, just like with DKA, because insulin is just going to drive that potassium into the cell anyway. So more or less the same. And then once the whole thing is fixed, then the patient may not need to stay on insulin. Unlike with DKA, insulin is just a part of their life. Now they need to stay on it for the rest of their life. There are some advanced concepts that I thought would be worth a special mention that I did not mention in my initial sort of rambling explanation. The role of catecholamines in the production of glucose. These are called counter-regulatory hormones. They include glucagon, adrenaline, and other catecholamines, and cortisol. So those are the main three though. Therefore, this sickness and increased stress, increasing the levels of glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol, because cortisol is a stress hormone, increases glucose production in the liver. And yep, you heard that right. Glucose can be made in the liver. This is called glycogenolysis. I sound like a baby when I say that, but yes, that's what it's called. It's basically when glycogen is broken down in the liver to make glucose. This process occurs in times of increasing energy demand or fasting. And another form of glucose manifestation is called gluconeogenesis, because it can't get any more complicated than this. I lie, it can. In the liver and the kidneys, glucose can essentially be recycled, for lack of a better term. And then I've written here, but synthesized is the better, more technical term. So yeah, glucose can be synthesized from things like lactate, glycerol, and other specific glucoid-like amino acids. So in times to basically what I'm trying to get at is the body actually has ways of producing glucose. And the liver is the main source of that. If we don't eat it or we're not eating enough, then the body can sort of supplement with these glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. And then I think I did read that insulin actually inhibits gluconeogenesis. So this last one from the liver and kidneys only happens in the absence of insulin. The more you know. I may have made you more confused, but that's okay. One last thing I didn't really mention is the effect of respiratory compensation on how people with DKA present. We know that they have metabolic acidosis. Yep. So they need a respiratory alkalosis, aka a low CO2, to offset the low bicarb. And how do we get rid of CO2? By breathing harder and faster. Thus, people with severe DKA will present with what's called Kussmaul's, I think that's how you say it, respirations, in which they breathe extremely hard and fast to get rid of as much CO2 as possible. Now, that's it for the learnings. But today was a very pathophysiology heavy episode, I know. I intentionally went as basic as possible with some aspects because I didn't want this to feel like a lecture. I wanted it to feel like more of a fun story time with lessons built in. If that is what you think this is turning into, more of a lecture, then please email me it'll be in the description below, or leave a comment. I appreciate all the feedback that you guys want to give, positive or critical, because I want to make this show the best that I can make it. Not for me though, for you, the listener. But anyway, that wraps up this episode of my show Chronicles of a Learner RN. I certainly have learnt a lot over the course of my entire semester, but for you today, and I hope you have too. I have a plethora of cases and learning experiences I'm excited to share with those of you that are willing to listen. If you enjoy what I do, what I say, and what I can bring to the table, then please comment, rate, subscribe to the podcast. It means a lot. Thank you, and see you next time.